Often we hear this myth that market forces and competition are the key to improving education. And the advocates of this idea that we just need to bring business into the classroom will tell you that it'll do the same thing for education that it's done for the marketplace, that we'll have innovations, we'll have things being done at a cheaper cost, and overall, all boats will rise with competition. But there's an underbelly to the competition myth, and in fact, I don't even think the myth is accurate. But there's something that's never mentioned by the advocates of competition and free market forces in education, and that is the cutthroat business tactics that often go hand in hand with business practices. Now, we accept those in the business realm because it's just the course of doing business, and unless something is a crime, usually people can get away with it. But what does that mean for education when we bring basically cutthroat business tactics and strategies into the education realm? Well, I think we had an excellent example of what this means this past week in Arizona, and it involved the Goldwater Institute, which is a very right-wing conservative organization in Arizona, funded by a lot of outside special interest groups. Clint Bollock, who heads their legal division, also happens to be on the board of the BASIS charter school system. Now, Mr. Bollock is one of the major free market advocates in the state and probably the country, and BASIS is often looked at as an example of how the free market is working in education. Well, let's take a look at what happened this week that perhaps calls into question some of the tactics currently being used by this free market advocate. Mr. Bollock and the Goldwater Institute during the last legislative session were able to get legislation passed that now makes it much more difficult for neighborhood school districts to advocate for overrides and bonds. These have become much more necessary because of the tremendous state cutbacks in education funding. School districts are forced to go to local voters and ask them to give them the authority to increase the capacity for tax revenue so that they'll have things for basics like funding all-day kindergarten, reducing class sizes, keeping PE, arts, and the likes. That's what's going on right now in the Scottsdale School District and many school districts statewide. Well, this past week, the Goldwater Institute, Mr. Bollock's legal arm of the Goldwater Institute, threatened to take legal action against the Scottsdale School District for allegedly violating this new law that the Goldwater Institute got passed in the last session. Now, who would stand to benefit from this? Well, there happens to be a BASIS Scottsdale. And BASIS Scottsdale, unlike some of the other BASIS campuses around the state, is fairly small. It only has 121 high school students compared to 662 high school students in Tucson. So if Scottsdale School District were to lose its override campaign this year because it's having to cut back on what it normally would do because of the new legislation and the threats of a lawsuit by Mr. Bollock's Goldwater Institute, who would stand to benefit? Well, presumably, Scottsdale BASIS would stand to benefit. And Mr. Bollock, as a BASIS board member, has no business being involved in this. It's a huge conflict of interest. But remember, we're in the free market where there's no regulation, no rules, no requirements for ethics or conflicts of interest, so this is completely permissible. In fact, Mr. Bollock in the Arizona Republic recently argued that there should be even fewer regulations for charter schools. So while he is imposing more regulations for district schools, making it more difficult for them to pass an override or a bond, he's actually out there writing in the Arizona Republic that there should be less regulation for charters, and because the costly and burdensome, their freedom from costly and burdensome regulation is the key to their success. Well, one of the regulations that does not exist for charter schools is to be very free and open with where their money goes. So we, for instance, don't know if Mr. Bollock is reimbursed at all for the role that he plays on the BASIS board. And in fact, when BASIS was asked whether or not they have a relationship between their business arm and their board arm, whether there's a fiduciary relationship on some paperwork that they had to file in opening a new school this year in San Antonio, I can show you what their response was. A completely blacked out page. Well, they believe that that is confidential proprietary information and does not have to be disclosed to the public because we're talking about their business arm. So again, what's good for the goose evidently is not good for the gander. We have very shark-like tactics going on here, and I compare the districts in this sense, the neighborhood schools, to dolphins, and they're being surrounded by folks who have a very different way of doing business, and their hands are being, tied behind their back by a lot of regulation and unnecessary laws being put forward with people like Mr. Bollock at the Goldwater Institute in the name of free market competition. So when you hear about that, when you hear that the free market makes things better in education, that competition will improve education, think twice about it. And think about the underbelly of competition in the United States, in our business markets. Our markets are amoral. Is that what we also want in our education system? An amoral system? And it doesn't matter who gets hurt or who wins or who loses. It's just how, smart you are, how clever, how wily you are. Is that really what we want for education and for our children in Arizona? It's not what I want. How about you, Dave?
Well, I assume when you say that the public schools are dolphins, you're comparing some of the schools like Basis and Clint Bollock being part of it to sharks who are more predatory.
Yes.
And I agree with you. Now, there's a perfect example, and I believe it was the Vail School District and the Benson School District who worked together. Vail was doing a tremendous job with their education. Instead of competing against Benson, which was a neighboring district, they said, here's what we're doing. And lo and behold, Benson actually topped Vail this year in terms of the school rankings.
Yes.
Well, this is wonderful.
Right.
Nobody got more money or less money.
Right.
The children benefited, and that's the point. Now, that's a kind of working together that's great. Competition, which involves, I'm going to do a better job in your education, I see what you can do, and I'm going to try to do even better. That's wonderful. That's really a spirited competition. But where I'm going to try to make your school less to make my school more, that is the business model. And there's nothing wrong with that out in the amoral world of business. That's what you do, so long as you said they stay within the laws, but it's not good for kids.
No, and what I thought was also interesting when I was looking at the San Antonio records also for Basis is when they were asked to share what their educational models were. Okay, so not even what your financial relationship is between these two organizations. It was a similarly blacked out page.
It's KFC's secret spices.
Secret spices. We aren't going to share that. If this is such a beautiful model and it's helping so many ordinary kids become extraordinary learners, then why aren't you out there sharing it with everybody? Because that really was what charter schools were allegedly set up to do. They were allegedly set up to help all kids, not to just help some people become probably very wealthy.
That's the way I think too as a teacher. If I came up with an idea that worked and somebody said, how did you teach All Quiet on the Western Front? I'd say, well, I started here and I went to this, and here's a slideshow I put together you might be able to use. The idea wasn't to be better than that person. The idea was to enhance that person and do the best job I could possibly do. But this, and I've looked at, excuse me, the same San Antonio application you looked at, there are 20 or 30 or 40 pages blacked out of an 80-page document. It's just astounding.
Well, and you have to remember, this is a public document, and we have to remember we're talking about public tax dollars. If you want to run a private school and run it like this, that's your prerogative, you can do that. But when you're getting public tax dollars, I'm sorry, but I think all of this should be public knowledge, public record, and I sure as heck don't think that Mr. Bollock should be allowed to do what he's been doing to try and undermine, the public school system.
This is education is a public good, and it has to be treated that way, especially when it's funded with public money.
That's right.